Voicecraft is modeling why dialogos without transfer dynamics. And there's a lot of talk about dialogos, but they have not avoided transfer dynamics. Now, a few other things. So we had oral societies, all right, and then we went into written societies. And what we're finding now is we need something like oral scoring, some sort of combination, or oral prose, actually, which would be the negation sublation, because what we're actually saying and going to see is a return to actually something like an oral tradition. And that's what's occurring with the liminal web.
I'm really interested to hear what, at least showing up to Voicecraft Network, what has that experience been, or what is that it to you? I'm curious what that it is that you're doing.
So for me, it's some kind of experience of relationship, and also an experience of grappling with ideas or a question that I don't get anywhere else. It connects me, or it sort of reconnects me to something that feels deeply important, but that's obscured. Like I'm not doing that in day-to-day life. It doesn't seem readily available to me in day-to-day life. It's a particular relational frame that allows me access to a type of relationship and a way of orienting to questions and ideas that I need. Like, it sustains me, like I know I need it. And in not being connected to that enough, I noticed the suffering that came from that. Like, this was a purposeful, I mean, in some way I say it was purposeful, in some ways I just found Voicecraft. I don't even know how I found it, but there was something in me that knew that this was really important, and I really needed to engage with this. And then, the first few times I joined, I had that experience, and then in between I'd think, I don't know if I want to go back. Like, but I just knew in me that it was connecting me to something that was missing elsewhere, and I needed it. And it's made me a better person all round. I know it's a very broad statement, but I just feel more fulfilled within myself, and I feel more in touch with something I was looking to be in touch with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, for me, this process is an attunement. I think you might have actually used that term, Aspasia, and that's exactly what it is for me. And it's attunement through the mode of authentic relating, and also in Voicecraft, particularly a kind of existential ontological inquiry. And it feels to me like, in some sense, there's like I think in one session we've maybe called it the stoke, and maybe the stoke is too specific, but there's a generalizable sort of zest for life, or a kind of intimacy or connectedness. And I think there you can get that in any way. Like, anything in reality can be a symbol or a portal to open us up to that. And part of what we access that through will be idiosyncratic, but then there also seem to be things that are universally more potent in their capacity to open us to that kind of intimacy with life. Yeah, and there's something for me about Voicecraft where there is a very specific flavor here, and this is the place I come for that flavor. And I'll take a stab at putting that flavor into words, because I do have different places I go for that connectedness, but when I come here, I'm going to the edge of my linguistic capacity. I'm going to the edge of my like archetypal intuition and sensibility. And there's something quite like artistic here, and almost in a way like maybe tribal, but all folded into a kind of like Voicecraft goes very deep for me. Like, its roots go all the way down. And it can kind of meet you in different places and different sensibilities. But I think in a way, like, just use an example, and I'm often sort of picking on this group, but for me, like, there's this new age sensibility, and it's playing this game. To me, Voicecraft can engage in the new age sensibility, but it also, to me, is going to layers that are maybe more esoteric than what's often found in those kind of spaces, but not in a way that is necessarily, for me, it's very authentic. Like, there's a genuine depth here, not a kind of, it's like almost like a universal depth rather than a particular depth. I know that's quite like an abstract expression, but there's something here where we're going straight to the source. So yeah, that's my initial thoughts.
I want to pick up on this connection between the universal and the particular, because when you mentioned the idiosyncratic approaches that each of us has, and yet still being able to communicate well across lines that would, in the majority of contexts, be quite rigid and quite difficult to cross. It's something about what you were speaking to earlier as well, Aspasia, regards the kind of vulnerability that we're invited to step into, and wanting to be protective of that in the way that we don't want it to get performative, maybe in the way that the new age sensibility does. I think that's what you were kind of getting at there, Tom. And then we were speaking to like the more authentic approach. And it's strange trying to put words to it, because it's like, in trying to put words to it, that's the signaling that we're trying to get out for people to actually also participate. And yet doing so would collapse the possibility of people taking their own idiosyncratic paths down to some kind of doctrine, which in communicating it might get in the way of the very thing that we're trying to do. Because I'm following along with what everyone's saying, and it's like everything that I want to say is being said. So it's like hard for my voice, for me to find what's actually right to say when it seems like everything's already being said that I would want to touch on. So it's, I don't know how to speak about it, to be honest, but there's something worthwhile in that.
It's almost the opposite of new age. It's like old age. It's like connected to something kind of like deeper and wiser. And yeah, that's what I kept thinking when you said new age. I kept thinking it's more like an old age. It's a return to something. And I agree. I agree with what you're saying. I think the best way for people to be introduced to it is to experience it. But it's experiential. People have to come and experience, but how you get people to come and experience, I'm not sure that the describing of what the experience is necessarily helpful or not. I don't know.
Well, just to add on there, I always hesitate to reference like the meta-modern sensibility because of the way that is understood in so many different ways and might have a lot of veiled meanings which I don't actually align with. But there is something about, like, you know, oscillating between the new and the old, the performative and the authentic, that, yeah, trying to concretize some sort of like marketing copy for it. Well, actually, just going back to what I mentioned to Tim last we caught up in person about not wanting to share it. It's more like wanting to cultivate the capacity for myself before even attempting to signal it, knowing full well that it will fail because I do not yet know how to speak it for myself yet. So it's like not completely cutting off that possibility, but trying to, well, not knowing when's the right time really to do that. Yeah, something like that.
So I'll say something broad and then go into it. Voicecraft is modeling wise dialogos without transfer dynamics. And there's a lot of talk about dialogos, but they have not avoided transfer dynamics. Now, a few other things. So we had oral societies, all right, and then we went into written societies. And what we're finding now is we need something like oral scoring, some sort of combination, or oral prose, actually, which would be the negation sublation, because what we're actually saying and going to see is a return to actually something like an oral tradition. And that's what's occurring with the liminal web, because we're finding we can't trust the written word. We are finding there's too much information to process, and we're finding that we're hungry for relation, right? Well, the thing about speaking is that's a way to transfer information, but it's always relational. We're also saying that relation is invaluable in the quality of information and the reliability of the information, right? What's very interesting, if you read a book like Invention of TV of News, Andrew Pettigrew, you can Ivan Illich as well. Very interesting. When the written word first came out, people were like, well, how can you trust this? You know, the only thing I trust is when someone speaks to me directly. If I'm not seeing someone face to face, how can I trust this? And now it's the exact opposite, right? We've gone through a phase where if it's not written, it's not real. And what we found is there's inadequacies to that. And we have the legitimization crisis. Nobody trusts news, fake news, and so on and so forth. So a negation sublation is some sort of return to an oral tradition, right? But here's a problem. How can you get oral portrayal of the complexity of the modern world, global warming, climate change, all these different topics, right? Well, it would require that people engaged in oral tradition are knowledgeable in those fields and are able to discuss those fields and go through one another, not in a manner of someone just giving a lecture, but actually working through to keep the relation alive. Well, that then makes you have a problem though, because how do you avoid the transfer dynamics where everyone then just tries to say what everyone else is saying, be like one another. Oh, if Tom thinks that way, I need to think like him. And what you get is the transfer dynamics. And that's where you get some trouble. Let's put a pin on that. There's a lot of emphasis today on collective intelligence. It's a very horizontal model where if we get more and more people, we'll get greater and greater collective intelligence. Well, actually, collective intelligence is what got you game A, right? Isn't that what is devouring the world? The issue that y'all all put your finger on, and it's why I'm very attracted to Voicecraft, is because there's an understanding that actually is you need more of a vertical model, where instead of a collective horizontal, which you do need to have some level of horizontal. If you have just vertical, you don't go anywhere. But if it's just horizontal, you're shallow, right? You don't have any depth. Well, when we talk about the vertical, that's the ability to go to the spiritual depths, then the intellectual complexity of global warming, then how I feel talking about global warming, then what Tim makes me feel, and then a meta-analysis of the relation of the conversation occurring. So you have this analyzation of how I feel in the conversation for the sake of the topic, because it is believed that global warming cannot be dealt with unless you do that vertical move, right? That is correct. We've thought too long that we could deal with these problems simply by getting more intelligence together. That's not the case, because people have emotional investment in the coal industry. They have emotional investment in certain politicians. They have they're spiritually lacking to understand why they shouldn't seek just money and profit, right? So if you're talking and I say to you, hey, you shouldn't live for money, that's just information. That's not going to change me. If you want to change me, we're going to have to go more vertically, right? The other reason why that vertical method that Voicecraft is so good at works and avoids transfer dynamics is because what ends up happening, and everyone, I've seen this a million times in Voicecraft, somebody says something, and rather than the people in the conversation try to mirror the other person, they pull back and go into the depth. That's how you avoid transfer dynamics. Instead of saying, oh, what did Tom say? Oh, how do I mirror what Tom says? You say, what? Wow, I listened, I heard Tom. And how does that make me go into a depth that then I'm going to figure out how to draw out and give to the group to create an interrelational dynamic that without we cannot deal with issues like global warming. It's not mirroring what you see in a lot of circling and a lot of dialogos, all of which has put its finger on the necessity of some sort of intersuppositional, as I call it, dynamic. But how do you avoid the transfer dynamic? How do you avoid everyone just saying what other people said or then becoming like one another? This is what Lacan and Cadell had that piece on. It's very, very, and you see it. You have to have an understanding of a withdrawal into a depth that then you bring out and then you share. So what you have is you have the horizontal, we're all here, but then when somebody says, you're not just looking at one another to see how one another responds and what they said to make sure I say something they agree with. What you do is, okay, I heard them. Now I'm going to pull in, so I'm not mirroring, and then I'm going to gift based on how I'm responding to what other people said. The last thing I will say is that I am in huge agreement that basically the quality of civilization is profoundly tied to its information technology and also its dialogical art, its quality of conversation, the ability of people to speak to one another. James Hunter warned that the only way the pluralized, globalized world would survive is if it learned how to do something called substantive democracy, which is not merely the discussion of issues, but to discuss first principles, axioms, different religions, the hermeneutics by which people understand the world, the relations by which they get along, which in human civilization, people have never actually had to do because they basically had pretty similar backgrounds. Everyone was Christian, everyone was Hindu, so on and so forth. Maybe you were Methodist and I was Baptist, but we had similar first principles. In a world where there is no givens, as we talk about in Belonging again, then you have to engage in an entirely different conversation. And a lot of the people talking about dialogos and circling, they're exactly right that has something to do with it. But you have to do it in a manner that does not fall into problematic transfer dynamics, that doesn't just emphasize a collective intelligence. You have to have the ability to go to a depth, speak about all the meta layers, and keep going, and keep going, and keep going. If indeed the quality of civilization and its ability to prosper is profoundly tied to its ability to exchange information, which then you could say that our goal today is not collective intelligence, but collective fullness. If and indeed all this is the case, then a model like what you see at Voicecraft is basically the only possibility of dealing with that problem. And if that problem is not dealt with, then you will continue to have tribalism, fundamentalism, withdrawal, and regression, as we are seeing on the global stage. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah, for me, Voicecraft, like it's fundamentally mysterious. You know what I mean? There's at the center of Voicecraft is a mystery, which is different from other groups that I participate in, right? Like I have a group of friends who I go rock climbing with, and like the center of our communion is rock climbing, right? Like that's what we do. And we might do other things. We might go to a movie or whatever, but like that's what holds us together, right? And we don't have to ask like, why are we here together? We're here together to go rock climbing, right? But here we're constantly asking this question, like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we drawn together, right? And the fact that we're asking that question is what draws me in, right? And so it's like, you know what I've been thinking about is the icon that you use for Voicecraft on YouTube and on this session in particular is the Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its own tail. And that, like, I'd be interested to hear like why you chose that, because that's like a deep symbolism, and like that's I think it's appropriate. I think it's very emblematic of the kind of conversation that we have here, right? Is that like it'll be going linear and then it kind of like turns back on itself when we sort of like we take this meta perspective and sort of like reflect back on the context of the conversation that we're having, right? Without losing the content, which is I think what happens, kind of like what Daniel was saying in a lot of other dialogo circling kind of things, where it's like we're just talking about where the conversation becomes about what the conversation is about, right? And it's like, wait, but what is the conversation about? Well, it's about figuring out what the conversation is about, and it kind of just goes in this circle and doesn't really like it loses the content, right? And I feel like what's cool about Voicecraft is that like we'll have a conversation about AI or something which is about AI, like it does stay on topic, but there's also the ability to like reflexively come back onto the nature of the conversation that we're having in real time, right? And that's pretty cool. But yeah, it is like, to me, it is fundamentally mysterious. Like there is a mystery at the center of it, which is I think what makes it so difficult to maybe communicate? Like I know you're kind of struggling with this of like how to reach out to people who aren't familiar with Voicecraft and who aren't familiar with sort of the liminal web or whatever, the context in which Voicecraft arose. Like how do you explain to somebody what it is that we're doing here? And it's not so easy, right? But I think that that's also the power of it, is that it's like we're drawn into this mystery, right? Which is particular, like it's a particular mystery, but it is a mystery nonetheless. And yeah, like I don't know. I know we're drawing to a close here, but maybe in another discussion we can talk about like the Ouroboros, because that to me is fascinating. So I don't know.
I have to jump in because what Highroot said was so fantastic. For me, what Voicecraft can do is make the implicit explicit without losing the implicit, then make the explicit implicit and go back and forth without losing it. It can do the reflective without losing the content and keep doing that. That is the character of what democratic discussion has to be to survive. That is an extremely unique style of conversation. So maybe Voicecraft, learning how to make the implicit explicit without losing it. Voicecraft, reflecting on the discussion of topics without losing the topic. The ability to make the implicit explicit without losing it is like the $1 million ability. Like it's extraordinarily rare. And that is what people have to be able to do to discuss first principles in pluralism. What is a first principle? That is the implicit that you never make explicit. How do you make it explicit without losing it? How do you discuss the structure of a conversation without ruining the conversation? That is the meta skill that makes all the difference in the world today. We don't have it. And if we don't get it, the consequences are dire. What Mr. Fishman said was excellent.